remarkable and appalling and overwhelming and terrifying all at the same time, if you have any sense of what it means. So that means that boys are paralyzed into terror.
His piercing gaze holds the power to unveil secrets that were once concealed, causing a tremor of anticipation and unease.
It's a big problem. It's a big problem. It's a real curse, that, in my opinion, because it's an easy out. And so we don't know what the consequences of that are. We're starting to understand some of them. But if you were better, you'd be more successful with women. But if you don't feel ennobled by your related, then perhaps that means it's of questionable utility. I certainly don't see it as a stabilizing social force. I don't see it as something people do in public and brag about. And I know that behavior is private and should remain that way, but you get what I'm driving at. One of the other things that you want to think about with regards to, and I think this is probably particularly true for women, is that to what degree is it in women's interests to allow the cost to fall to zero? Because it certainly does that. And it just seems to me that that's not a very good long-term strategy for relationships between men and women, because whatever is worth, the cost of zero is the wrong price. Well, what should you do with? Well, you know the answer to that, and so does everybody else. Everyone knows it's not good. It's not good for those who produce it. It's not good for those who participate, wittingly or unwittingly, because there's plenty of them, in its production. It's not good for its consumers. What advice would you give to someone looking to quit? Well, I gave some advice a little earlier about quitting alcohol, and I would say it isn't that you're trying to quit. It's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that you're trying to figure out how to have a better life. And so you have to figure out, well, I would say do the future authoring program and keep your addiction in mind and think. So in the first part of the future authoring program, it asks you a bunch of questions about what your life could be like in 3 to 5 years if you took care of yourself like you were someone that you cared for.
His words transform into a clarion call, alerting society to a truth that carries profound and unsettling implications.
So imagine there's and I guess we're into thou shalt not commit adultery, by the way, which is the next commandment. You can imagine an erotic image that compels desire, and I think that's part of what we're discussing, the morality of that, or its potential to be an implement to the instantiation of an ideal. You can imagine a situation where your desire is to sleep with your neighbor's wife. You're not acting on it, but the reason you're not acting on it is because she doesn't want to sleep with you. Now, it still seems to me that given that your desire is to undertake the act, and the only reason that you're not able to manage it has nothing to do with your moral stance, it has to do with the impossibility of the action. Now, given I don't know how you would deal with that. It certainly led to the of our society, which I really think is actually quite dreadful. Maybe that's my innate prudishness, but I don't know. It seems to me that it demeans the participants as well as the viewers. There's something second-rate and furtive about it, and I think that everybody who engages in it knows that. It's a substitute for the real adventure of life, and I do think that it leads to a certain kind of perhaps contempt. It leads to contempt, I would say, and that can't be a good thing. I mean, I don't ever think, and you guys can ask yourself this question, I mean, have you ever met anybody who finished and then was proud about it, and who stood up straighter because of it, and who felt that they'd really conquered life as a consequence? I mean, I just don't believe that that's the general post feeling. I don't believe that. I believe that it's like it's something you do when you don't have the right thing to do, and it's an admission that you're a second-rate player, essentially, something like that.
Peterson's voice becomes a catalyst for contemplation, sparking conversations that delve into the chilling depths of his revelation.
And the problem with one of many problems is that it drives desperation on the male front down to zero. Now, I know perfectly well from my clinical experience that the standard state of most young men, especially under 20, let's say, is pretty much terror in the face of a woman who they're very attracted to. And the reason for that is that, well, there's all sorts of reasons, but the primary reason is the probability that any given male, even one who's very attractive, let's say in multiple ways, is going to be rejected by any given female, especially a high-value female who has a lot of people attracted to her, is extremely high. So there are classic psychological experiments showing this. You know, if you send attractive undergraduates out to talk to other undergraduates to offer access, say, well, you know, would you be willing to have coffee with me? Would you be willing to give me your phone number? Would you be willing to come back to my apartment? If the girls offer that, then whoever they're offering that to on the male front will take them up on their offer. But if the boys offer that, even when they're attractive, the probability that their advances will be rejected is extremely high. And so young men face the uncomfortable situation where even if they're competent and will turn eventually into useful men, which isn't the status of most very young men, the probability that they'll be rejected is extremely high. And then it's also the case that there's little that's more psychologically impactful than such rejection, especially if it's undertaken by someone to whom there's a genuine attraction. So that means that boys are paralyzed into terror. Then it asks you questions about your friends and your family and your career and your time outside of work and your health and, you know, the important dimensions of life. And it asks you to spend 20 minutes writing about how good your life could be in 3 to 5 years if you got your act together and did what was good for you. And then it asks you to write about the hell you could be in if you didn't. And so I would say you really need to do that, because it isn't the issue. The issue is that you're not living your life the way you want to. And so you need a vision of life that's more compelling than the counter vision too that frightens you. You know, because otherwise it's obviously extraordinarily gratifying in the short term, but you seem to be suffering from the medium to long-term consequences of its use. And so you need a story that you can tell yourself that's really deeply thought through about why this is not appropriate for you, how it's hurting you, and how it's minimizing you, perhaps making you embarrassed and ashamed and social isolation and all of that. So I would say, think about it as cleaning up your psyche and your behavior rather than you stopping. You also might want to write down, and you could do this in the negative vision part of the future outcome program. You got to write down everything bad that you think is doing to you, because obviously you have some suspicions that this is not good for you, right? That it's actually harming you in some important way. And so you need to be fully cognizant of what those ways are and then take them seriously and decide if that's the pathway through life on which you wish to travel. And so, and then I would also say good luck to you. You know, it's a very good idea to identify one of your weaknesses and work on it. You can strengthen yourself substantially by doing that.
The spotlight sharpens on Peterson, a harbinger of unsettling truths, unafraid to delve into the abyss of knowledge and its consequences.
Who is in control? Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? You know, if you're, and the consequence of that is an immediate influx of guilt, then you have to ask yourself, who's in control? And that's a really important question, who's in control. That's what terrified me about developing some psychoanalytic acumen, because once you realize that you're a house that many spirits can and do inhabit, and that many of them aren't you, and that many of them aren't working towards the purposes you might want yourself to be working to, and that's the realization of the myth that you're embodying from the Jungian perspective. It's a very, very serious question. The fundamental human myth is Cain versus Abel. And so who are you? Are you Cain or Abel? Well, the answer is you're both. And then the question is, well, who's got the upper hand? And then the next question is, who do you want to have the upper hand? Is it God and Abel or Satan and Cain? And that's a question that's just as germane to non-believers as it is to believers. And isn't that remarkable and appalling and overwhelming and terrifying all at the same time, if you have any sense of what it means? So if your behavior is embarrassing you, well, there's only two possibilities, isn't there? You shouldn't be so embarrassed. And I suppose the voice that says yes to all expression of human would say that your guilt and shame is merely the detrimental hangover of an oppressive patriarchy that's judgmental in its attitudes towards. Well, yeah, well, what would you use judgment to differentiate if it isn't sexuality?
So what does do? Well, that's pretty self-evident once you know those other facts. It's like it tilts people hard towards a short-term mating outlook, and that's a bad idea. It's like it's not a good idea to employ in the services of short-term gratification. Why? Because short-term gratification is a bad strategy. Why? Because short-term gratification doesn't iterate well, and you know this. This is why it's not that good an idea to overuse cocaine.
In this haunting juncture, Jordan Peterson stands as a revealer of disquieting revelations, urging society to grapple with the unsettling implications of the truth he has just unveiled.
You know, I say that knowing that I believe the research evidence shows that if you introduce into a community, that rates of committed by men on women actually decline. So there is perhaps some utility in the outlet, but you know, that's a unidimensional analysis and doesn't take into account all the other effects of, so including the ones you described. And I think that those are real. It makes sense that they're real, you know, because it's super satiation, and it's a non-trivial technological problem. You know, it's now possible for young men to look at more beautiful women in one day than any man has ever seen, you know, prior to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, than any man in history had ever seen. That's not nothing. That's something. And to think that doesn't do anything to you, it's like, no, that likely does something to you. So don't substitute the false for the real. And don't underestimate the utility of deprivation. You know, what do we need to drive us forward to have the adventure of our life? You know, well, some deprivation, that's for sure. That heightens desire and drive, and maybe you need that. You're afraid to approach a woman. Well, you remove part of your drive and so now you don't have that urge to overcome that anxiety, and so you stay timid for your entire life. You know, maybe not, but maybe.
What does cocaine do? Well, you have a biological system within you that is activated when you're moving towards valuable goals, and the subjective experience of activation of that system is positive emotion. It's enthusiasm. It's engagement. It's the sense that you're doing something vital and meaningful. And cocaine and like it activate that system. So it's no mystery at all why people will use cocaine. Well, so what happens if you use it all the time? The answer is you go downhill very, very rapidly. And short-term impulsive hedonic gratification is not a strategy that iterates well across time. And short-term gratification strategies have exactly the same problem. Now, imagine this is happening more and more commonly, by the way. So, as women free themselves from the shackles of monogamous relationships and are more likely to engage in short-term mating strategies, you might think that's a very good thing for men. But turns out it's not such a good thing for men, because women are quite picky, and so women rate 80% of men online as below average in attractiveness, and whereas men rate 50% of women as below average in attractiveness, which by the way is true, right, statistically, but it's 80% of men.
I don't know that
I don't know the literature on the decline in sexual activity well enough to know if it's valid or reliable. But I mean, I think that, you know, in a stable society, you take lots of things for granted. You take the fact that men and women are going to be attracted to one another for granted. And even though it's more fragile than it appears, you know, it's suppressed more easily than you might think. And you take the idea that men and women are going to move together towards the establishment of long-term intimate relationships for granted. But that's partly because you don't understand what invisible preconditions exist to make that self-evident. You know, and when those invisible preconditions are disrupted by rapid technological or sociological change, then things shift underneath you and you don't know why.